This is December the 12th, 2014, and I'm interviewing Michael Petit, Commissioner of the Department of Human Services under Governor Brennan during his administration. My name is Richard Davies. Michael, tell us a little bit about what you were doing before you joined the Brennan administration, just sort of background.
I'm a social worker, and I had been working for the United Way of Greater Portland. I was their planning director. I was a lobbyist, and that's how I came to know Joe Brennan. He was representing Portland, both first in the House and then in the Senate. And I was young. I was just out of graduate school, and I quickly saw that Joe Brennan was somebody that cared about the issues that we cared about. So for a 6 or 7 year period, I worked at United Way and was interacting with him, his office, people that he was associated with on a regular basis.
And did you play any kind of role in his gubernatorial campaign in 1978?
I'd like to think I did, and I'd like to think that was positive, but you never know about these things. Actually, he ran in 74, as you know, and I don't know if that's what you said was 74, but I worked and supported him in the 74 campaign, and of course he lost that race, and George Mitchell won that race, and then Jim Longley got elected, and of course Joe became the Attorney General, and for the next 4 years I would visit him periodically, and then in 78 spent a lot of time on the campaign, everything from canvassing to driving him around to writing position papers to whatever it is that he needed at that point. But it was clear that he was in a very positive position, I think, to win the governor's office.
During that time while he was Attorney General, did you interact with him enough so that you had a sense of how he was developing his thinking about human resource issues, human needs?
Well, first I picked that up when he was in the legislature. Mm-hmm. So, for example, he was always the first one out of the chute in opposition to capital punishment. And he had a very, very strong sense of social justice. And while he was the district attorney locally, he was, I think, the first district attorney in the state of Maine to bring a excessive force police brutality charge against Portland Police Department, and if I recall correctly, his home was fired upon during the time that he was there. So I thought he showed a lot of courage in taking that position. And then as Attorney General, there was a case that I was aware of, a little boy that was killed. And we had had gotten the legislature to adopt a piece of legislation on mandatory reporting of child abuse. And Maine Medical Center had seen this child, had not reported. And I encouraged Joe, then the Attorney General, to be the first person in the state to ever conduct an investigation of a failure to report, because all these children, they're babies, they're 2, they're 3, they're 4. This Michael Fitzgerald case, child was 3 years old and he was killed. And to my great satisfaction and surprise, Attorney General Brennan said, we'll conduct an investigation of it. And he conducted an investigation, and he found that they hadn't reported in a timely fashion. He made a point of it publicly. It attracted attention, and what that did is spur more people to accept responsibility for reporting to the government when a child was in trouble. So I saw very early on with Joe Brennan that he was personally courageous in a quiet way, and he was not afraid of tackling issues. And he would do it in a gentlemanly enough fashion, as he was later on, that he didn't stir the kind of wild opposition that someone who might have been more strident would have generated.
Following the election, I assume the governor approached you about the possibility of serving in his administration.
Well, he didn't, but one of his minions did, and I had actually not thought about it, even though I'd been in the field. And I remember when I met with the governor about it, when I actually voiced doubt and said, geez, I'm not sure this is a lot of responsibility, he said, look, the competition isn't Jesus Christ or Mahatma Gandhi or Martin Luther King, it's these 3 guys. Could you do it better than them? I said, yes, I could. I think I could. He said, so don't worry about it. So, yes, they approached me, and I was very honored to be appointed.
At that time, did the governor talk with you about the areas that he was most particularly interested in and that would intersect with Department of Human Services?
Well, he did. I had known him quite well, driving around with him, to obscure places in Maine, leaving early in the morning and, making these stops to address 7 people of the Franklin County Democratic Committee or something like that. So we got to talking an awful lot, and I came to understand better what his value system was, and he came to understand better what mine was, and it turned out we were pretty compatible on it. And what I'll never forget is he had one admonition. There was one thing that he said. He said, "Listen," he said, "we're going to be here for 4 to 8 years. Let's leave the place a little bit better off than how we found it." And I was always moved by that. And of course, he hated seeing injustice against anybody. So he knew that kids were being hurt. He knew that old people were being hurt. And he also shared a strong view that I did, that every citizen should have health insurance. And that set the stage for his willingness to take on a very, I think, aggressive posture against health care costs, medical care costs, which resulted in Maine creating its version of a Public Utilities Commission for hospital rate setting. And, he led that, and, we were the engineers within the Department of Human Services on it. But, I worked with him for 8 years, and I got to say, we were pretty much on the same page. He wanted government to be a positive force for people, did not view it as a negative, and anything that it was doing wrong, let's correct it, and then let's go forward.
Did you see him as someone who came to you with things that he wanted you to do, or was he looking to you for ideas that he could support wherever was appropriate to move them forward?
It's always a bit of the two, right? It's always a bit of the two, in which he, of course, had personal beliefs in something, but he was a lawyer and he was a prosecutor and he was a defendant, and not a defendant, he defended people. But in so doing, he acquired a level of specialized knowledge as other people were doing in their areas. So what I got from him was, look, I'm broadly interested in moving the ball forward, but you tell me what you think it is that we should be doing. And there's a reason why, if you look at the resumes of the commissioners, you'll see very few people dropped out during his entire 8-year tenure. And the reason for that, I think, was he was so receptive to other people defining what might be done, and then he'd weigh it and evaluate it and decide, is this a good idea or not? I never found him to interfere with any of the legal aspects of this thing, which there was always plenty of room for mischief. He always stayed completely away from that. So I'd say it was a combination of his saying, gee, what if we did something and made sure these elderly, end their lives in some dignity and not drugged up in a facility that they don't want to be in. But if, in my particular case, I was, fairly, what's the right word, pretty aggressive on some of these issues, so there was no shortage of ideas that we would present to him, and I found that he always treated them seriously.
Yeah. Now, obviously, there were a number of initiatives that he undertook that were of significant import to the constituency of your department.
Yep.
You want to talk a little bit about some of those, particularly in the first term?
Well, believe me, it's a long list of things that he was really enabling us by his virtue of communicating with the public and his having won an election, bestowing that momentum. I mean, the first thing that I approached him on was creating 3 task forces on issues that I knew needed to be addressed. One was on foster care, one was on maternal and child health, and one was on long-term care for the elderly. And in each case, we said, Governor, how about you appoint a commission that is comprised of this, 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 and this. Here are some people that we think would be good on it. Why don't you name 3 chairs of people who would be credible? One was I think it was Peter Mills, the senior Mills, whatever, I forget his name, but he was an elderly gentleman at that time.
Yeah.
And then Tom Allen, and then a physician whose name I forget, but creating these governor's commissions immediately demanded attention by the press, demanded attention by constituents, and all 3 of them put forward very positive agendas that he would put in front of the legislature. And I think that was a unique kind of situation. If you look and see, when he came into office, which was really the winter of '79, we were in the middle of this triple-digit misery situation. You know, the unemployment rate, the interest rates, and what was the third one? The inflation rate. And here he was willing to take our stuff to the legislature on important matters that really made a difference with people. You know, when I went in for a hearing before the legislature, due to my appointment, you know, because of the appointment, you know, I was 33 years old, and I recall, you know, the Department of Human Services at the time was pointed out to me by these lawmakers, was the hallways were filled with bills for Medicaid. I mean, they were coming in at the rate of 10,000 bills a day, involving tens of millions of dollars, and there wasn't a system to pay the providers. And I remember them asking me, you know, what are you going to do about it? And I remember saying to them, listen, you know, I'm a young person, but, you know, I don't have any bills. And I grew up in a household in which you pay your bills and you make sure that you take care of that, and then you can do other things. I said, so what I'm going to tell you right now is that if we don't deal with this issue right now, all the other things we're interested in aren't going to be able to happen. So I went to Joe, the governor at that point, and said, listen, we've now been on this 3 or 4 months, and, you know, what you basically inherited without knowing about it was a large built-in deficit into this Medicaid program, and for 10 or 12 or 15 years, the department had to come in for supplemental. I said, if you catch us up on this and allow us to pay all these bills right now, I promise we will not come back for supplemental on the Medicaid budget. And he said, all right, let's do it. It was an expensive proposition. It was many millions of dollars. He did it. There was no net gain for the public at that point. I mean, it wasn't like handing out something. This was paying for old debts. But he was quick to respond. And then we did go 7 years without having to come back and ask for Medicaid supplement, which, you know, he was pleased with and we were pleased with. And it meant that we had those costs enough under control that we could do some other things, like dental care and after-school programs and pre-K and a bunch of other things.
So what was sort of the agenda that you wanted to lay out for him in that first term in office? You had the commissions that were set up. I assume that they reported back, and did they propose things for the legislature?
Sure. I mean, listen, there was a bunch of things. I mean, just take, for example, that Maine's nursing home population had doubled, quadrupled, quintupled in the decade of 15 years prior to the governor coming on. Well, if you do a poll, I mean, look, we need nursing homes given the kind of culture we live in and the era that we live in, but nobody wants to be in them. And they're expensive, and they're away from family, and they may be located in different places. So what we ended up doing was the Department of Human Services, in the past, through its Certificate of Need legislation, was approving all these nursing homes without consulting with the legislature. And all of a sudden, the legislature would come back a year or two later, and somebody would say, listen, while you were gone, we built 500 new beds at a cost of $100,000 apiece, and the bill is due. And the lawmakers who represent the people of Maine said, what is this? How did this happen? So what we ended up doing with that task force, again, this was a gutsy move, I think, on the governor's part. We said, let's freeze any expansion of nursing homes for a year, let this task force get its job done, and then we'll go from there. And what ended up happening with that particular piece was we agreed that we would only approve 100 nursing home beds a year without consulting the legislature. Anything beyond that, we would get the legislature's sign off on it, and we wouldn't ask for any dough without letting them know that we were doing something. Did they agree with it? And so I think that was a very important piece. What we ended up doing with that, because people still had a need to be cared for, is under Joe Brennan, and Maine was one of the few states in the country that did this, is a combination of federal money, state money, which was really unique. There were no states who were really putting much money into long-term care to keep people in their own homes, and families were pulled in. So area agencies on aging, the families, all came together and said, how do we keep this person out of an institution and enable them to stay at home? And we were even able to do things like, you're working at a shoe factory, we'll pay you whatever you're making at the shoe factory to stay home and take care of your mother, because otherwise she's headed for a nursing home, she's going to be unhappy, and it's going to cost us 3 times as much. We did that all over the state of Maine, and I think that was a very significant development. The biggest piece for me was not absorbing the deep cuts in health and social services that Ronald Reagan proposed and succeeded in implementing. And as far as I'm concerned, if there is a highlight for me doing what I was doing in Joe Brennan's tenure, it was in the winter of '81 at the National Governors Association when Ronald Reagan was swept into office, defeating Jimmy Carter, and the country was in dire straits in terms of inflation was 15%, unemployment rate was 10%, interest rates hit as high as 20%, and all across the country, Reagan had proposed cuts in children's services and healthcare spending and services to the mentally ill, food stamps, the AFDC, the Aid to Families of Dependent Children program, Medicaid, cuts in the tens of billions, hundreds of billions. And at a National Governors Association conference in Washington, D.C., I think it was in February or March of that year, he was the first governor, and there were only 2 governors, that rejected what Reagan was proposing, and 48 other governors had accepted what Reagan was proposing without ever seeing any of the details. And when I would come down to Washington to meet with other commissioners, and they'd say to each other, well, how much did you get hit by? How much did you get hit by? How much did you lose? And when it came to my turn, and this little small state, cold in the northeastern corner of the country, said, geez, we really saw virtually no cuts. They said, well, how did that happen? I don't know. We worked with our governor. We held public hearings. We found money. We paid this. They did that. And we were basically able to protect maternal and child health services, daycare services, people being able to stay in their homes. That was not true in much of the rest of the country, and it's still true today in many of those states. They've never recovered from those level of cuts. So I thought it was really a very positive thing, and that allowed us, with that base, instead of our cutting, we started growing services, and we were teased sometimes by, and he was teased sometimes by other commissioners saying, don't let Petit in the door because, the Department of Human Services is going to be asking for some resources. Let me give you one example of, I've talked about the macro, but let me just do a micro piece. Joseph E. Brennan was, we knew he was Irish. And his family reminded us that he was Irish, and Joey and all the whole rest of the crew. And so one time I would ask him, I do these barnstorming tours of the state, visiting all these places that the Department of Human Services licenses. I mean, everything from atomic power plants a little bit, all the way to restaurants and, nursing homes and daycare centers and so forth. So I'd ask the governor, I said, listen, would you like to join us? We're going to make 15 stops in a day, 18 stops in a day. It's a whistle stop situation. But believe me, people like seeing you come in, and, would you be willing to join me and LaPointe and whoever his guy was? He said, yeah, let's do that. And so we go to all these different places. Finally, we climb up the second or third story floor tenement house in Bangor. And we walk in, and there's a woman, Mrs. McGillicuddy, who had 2 5-year-old kids with cystic fibrosis that she was caring for. They weren't her children. She was a foster mother. And she was a very modest woman, and she was clearly a very loving foster parent with these children. And I dare say that Joe Brennan coming into her little apartment was one of the highlights of her career. And so we come back to, Augusta, and the governor having absorbed all this stuff. And one of the things I'd asked of the governor when he said, do you want to do this? I said, can I present the budget to you directly? I don't want to go through a lot of other people. And he said, yes, but I'll have the other people in the room. So I said, okay, fine, but I just need for you to be there so you can see and hear what I'm seeing. So Rod Scribner, the Commissioner of Finance, who is a terrific person and did a great job managing the resources during the administration, he's in the room, with me. And he's a little irritated to begin with because I'm not having to go through the whole ranks on this thing. And he says, well, Governor, he says, look at this. He said, Michael's proposing a 100% increase in spending here on this foster care thing. And the governor looked at me and said, Michael, is that true, 100%? I said, Governor, it is. I said, you might remember Mrs. McGillicuddy. I said, she was getting $120 a month for taking care of those children, and this would now give her $240 a month. And he just looked at Commissioner Scribner. He said, it's fine. He said, just let it happen. And it was an example of his own personal humanity, seeing up close, who wants this job? I mean, this is a tough job. It's as tough a job as there is. And he was saying, of course, this person should be compensated for this kind of thing. So that's the governor that I knew.
I get the sense that first year or two, the administration, you were sort of trying to catch up with problems that had existed beforehand. I assume at some point you started laying out an agenda of things that you'd like to
Right.
do on that. You want to talk a little bit about some
Yeah,
of those?
yeah. Well, first of all, I think you've got it right in that there was everybody inherits something, but we really inherited some major dollar problems that I think it was clear to him and clear to me that if we didn't get over those right away, it was going to be hard to do anything else. And it's one of the reasons why he supported this hospital cost containment legislation, because it's at one point, the hospitals in Maine, God bless them, were running up costs, and they had a gold American Express card that the bill didn't go to them.
Yeah.
It went to the citizens of Maine. So we did a number of things to bring that under control. And then what ended up happening in terms of various initiatives is we had an excellent long-term care program, a bit of which I was describing, that ran over a 6 or 8 year period. It allowed us to really concentrate on certificate of need, in which we issued affirmatively millions, but we also denied millions in what we felt was unnecessary construction. We were able to greatly improve child protective services across the state of Maine. We succeeded in getting a lot more. We worked closely with district attorneys who helped us get a lot more prosecutions in child sexual abuse cases. We supported the Department of Mental Health and Corrections efforts to greatly expand the number of small bed facilities scattered around the state to deal with mentally disabled people. Even simple things like, if you wanted to be a foster parent in Maine, you had to have your water inspected, and you had to pay for it. And I went to a meeting with foster parents, and I thought, you got to be kidding. We charge you for that? And I said, who charges you? And they said, the Department of Public Health. I said, the Department of Public Health, that's under our jurisdiction. I said, we're going back right now and abolishing that kind of thing. We didn't create a stir on most of the stuff because it was pretty much self-evident that these were good things to do, but the governor unfailingly supported stuff, even when it was politically controversial. And I'll give you one prime example of where that happened, which allowed us to do some other things. And that was, this is 30 years now, 35 years ago, so I may have a couple of the details wrong, but we'll draw as best we can. There was a proposition to build a veterans home in Augusta, and it was election year. And so you have the AMVETS and the American Legion and all these great groups of older soldiers. And there was a proposition put forward. It was something like a 250-bed nursing home was going to be in Augusta. And we looked at it and said, geez, is this really what people want? And we talked with some of the veterans groups, we talked with some of the older people, and we said, listen, if you had a choice of being in your own bed in Madawaska in the last 3 months of your life, or being in Augusta, 300 miles away, 7 hours away from your grandkids, and what we were being told is, well, they want to be with their friends. They want, these old soldiers want to be with their friends. I said, well, do they want to be with their families? Yes, they want to be with their families. So we ended up saying no to the 240 beds. And if you do the mathematics on it, it's an obligation into the future of hundreds of millions of dollars for something that we weren't persuaded that a lot of people wanted. So what we ended up with was proposing much smaller facility in Augusta, and then a series of satellite, smaller operations around the state, which is exactly what's happened. There's several of these locations around there. And this was election year, and we had the veterans groups formally protesting, some of them, what we were doing. It would have been very easy for the governor, as some of his staff want to do, but it would have been very easy for the governor to say, Michael, it's an election year. Why are you getting all these veterans upset? He never said a word. He knew that there were staff that were saying, my goodness, it's an election year. You got to get these guys to approve this facility. He said, listen, we're going to stand back from it. They have a process. They know what they're doing. We get briefed on it. We'll let the chips fall where they may. It's interesting to me, when we saw the polling going into the 82 election cycle, there were three issues that were really at the top. I don't remember who did these polls, but the three, one was the Maine Yankee atomic power plant. Remember all of that? They were going to shut that down.
Yep.
One was hospital cost containment, and the other one was child abuse and neglect.
Yep.
And if you take a look at that polling, it was clear to me that the public was engaged, the governor was on top of these things, and two of the three issues were ones that we were very deeply going after, and we could only have done these things had we had a governor who was supportive of it and did not worry about the particular details in terms of conflict and controversy. He knew that that was just, look, these politicians are all smart, right? On a bad day, only 49% of the people don't like you, right? I mean, on a good day, only 49% of the people don't like you, right? And so he didn't need 49%. If I recall correctly, after the '82 election, he won by the largest margin of any governor going back to about 1850.
Won every county.
Yeah, he did. And I think part of that was not just what was happening in human services, but what was happening in the environment, what was happening in mental health, what was happening in economic development, on bond questions. I mean, it was a very progressive agenda that he was putting forward. And, you know, to his credit, I mean, he did it with a great deal of modesty, but very steel determination. And there was no question. I mean, here's what I learned in going over there, because I didn't get my way every time. I'd go over there and I'd say, Governor, you know, what do you think about doing this? And if he had any hint of, you know, he'd say, well, maybe. And I think, okay, I can get another bite of the apple. I'll come back later on if he said maybe. But when he said no, forget it. I don't care. On principle alone, he wouldn't change his mind. Once he said no to me, it was like, do not ask me this question again. And I go back and lick my wounds with some of the staff and say, he said no. And everybody knew what that meant. It's like, drop this idea and go on to the next thing. And that was one of the things that I really admired about him was he was very intelligent. He would absorb the material. He would give you an opinion, but he wouldn't say, he would close with, do what you think is right. He always closed it with, do what you think is right.
And we think that you probably did.
We tried, right? All you can do is try. That's what Mother Teresa says. We're not called upon to be successful, just to try. You know, and I think Joe Brennan was of that school of what we like to call, you know, incremental theory of change, right? 2 steps forward, 1 step back. I mean, everything didn't go the way that we wanted it to, but I'd like to think that at the end of his term, a lot of Maine people were a bit better off. You know, I'll give you another example of a major initiative that most people to this day don't know it was a major initiative, but when I tell you about it, you'll see that a lot of people benefited from it. I grew up in a community way back when, a French-Canadian community in Petit Saco area, in which everyone in my age bracket, or virtually everyone in my age bracket, had very bad teeth. And that was because of an absence of fluoride and because of the culture, the diet that we had. You know, it was just too much sugar is basically what it came down to. And so it was not unusual, as in my case, to have 70, 80, 90, 100 cavities over a period of time, you know, as growing up. And when I was at United Way, we did a report on dental decay in Cumberland County. And we showed that it turned out Maine ranked 50th in the nation in dental disease, which they got from the selective service exams during World War II. So I was with United Way then, and we work with local school departments in which we instituted a program. We did this big report on dental health. We did this program that the kids would get the swish and rinse thing at school. They'd get a little cup of fluoride, which they swish and spit. Then they'd get fluoride toothpaste and toothbrush, and they would get dental floss. The cost for a year for doing this per kid was under $2. The schools would do it for free. What we saw was a rapid improvement in the quality of care, you know, the quality of the dental hygiene of these kids. I become the commissioner, and we introduced legislation, thanks to the governor, to create an Office of Dental Health. And we ended up creating an Office of Dental Health and funding it. And all across the state of Maine, these schools, whether on public water supplies or on school wells, all of a sudden had fluoride available to them. I have 3 daughters. I have 5 grandkids. I don't know if among the 8 of them, there's 2 cavities. They don't have cavities because of the dental stuff. So this was kind of like a quiet piece of thing that we had people working on. But again, had Joe Brennan not said, that's a good piece of legislation, let's introduce it, we'll fight it out with the legislature if we have to, but we need to improve people's dental health, and we made big dents in it.
Yeah. Clearly one of the really big health-related issues was one that you'd already made some passing reference to the hospital cost containment effort. We've already had Frank McGinty's view on some of that stuff. We'd like to have your thinking on that from the perspective of the commissioner's chair.
Well, look, this was an issue that, the first paper that I did on universal health care and national health insurance was in 1968. I was in graduate school. And it didn't take long, it by chance, because of this political thing, that a mere 10 years later, I was working for a governor where we could actually talk about these kinds of things, And this was the Ted Kennedy bill back in '68, and of course the governor was a big admirer of Ted Kennedy, and he and I were both big admirers of universal health care for everybody. And so we saw how out of control the spending was. It was like everybody had to have a nuclear magnetic resonator, everybody had to have helicopter pads, everybody had to have this, everybody had to have that. In a state like Maine, I mean, where do you get the money to pay for this sort of stuff? So we wanted to take a serious approach to controlling costs, and we asked the governor, is this something that he would be willing to really take on? And he did so with relish. And he and I and myself and Frank McGinney particularly were the two principal salespeople in terms of going out into the different counties, and Frank would have his agenda and I'd have my agenda, and we'd give a talk on why this was important to do. And what the governor did to perfection is he would host these breakfast meetings, and he'd bring in the clergy for one breakfast meeting. He'd bring in the business guys for another meeting. He'd bring in the union guys for another meeting. Frank and I would be there, and the governor, was it Ivy? Was it Ivy? The woman who.
Oh, yeah, the Blade House.
Yeah, but I think it was Ivy.
Yeah,
Anyways,
that's
she was a wonderful woman who did the breakfast and
Yep.
kind of served the different people and so forth. And we'd be at a small table of 8 or 10. And when that bill first got dropped into the legislature, a certain prominent Democratic lobbyist said, "Dead on arrival," representing the hospital association, medical association. This is never going to pass. This is going to get killed, etc. And so there, McGinty and I going out every place that we can, pitching this thing. It was in the press a lot, of course, and the governor quietly was hosting the Episcopal bishop, the head of the AFL-CIO, Bath Iron Works, New England Telephone, LL Bean. I mean, bringing them all in, because everybody said, wait a minute, this is ridiculous. We're getting these 10, 15, 20% pops in our insurance each year, and nobody's getting any more services than they were last year, and it means that we can't give people cash raises, which is what we'd rather do, is give them cash in their pocket than pay more for insurance. So eventually, we had a hearing on this thing, and I think there may have been as many as 500 people, it might have been more, at this hearing. And other than the hospital association and related affinity groups, there was overwhelming public sentiment to bring this under control. So my thing on this one was that this was I think there was only one other state at the time that had something similar, and it was an example of government duly constituted with support of the electorate saying to people that we needed, but they were certainly acting like a special interest group. The governor just said, we're going to go for this, and he did, and of course it got repealed after he left office by somebody else, but it was a very good idea, I thought. It did bang back costs, and it was one of, I think, many initiatives that he supported that benefited people. Now, did McGinty say much different than that? Because I need to talk with him.
He talked maybe in more words and some of the more detailed pieces of that, but
You don't need that from me.
No.
But I will tell you, just anecdotally, if I may, I had Aroostook County. So when Frank and I divided up the counties, I always liked Aroostook County. So I said, let me go up to Aroostook County. And I was in Holton at a senior citizens home. And we were in the kitchen area there where everybody was seated. And I had been up there, and I had already I was doing all the hospitals. And so I had done Fort Kent, and then I went over to Presque Isle and Caribou. And by the time the end of the week came, I was in Holton, and I have to say I was tired. And so I get up first and speak, and there's 100 people in the room, and they're all white hairs, and then there's a panel of people sitting here who are representing, the medical community. So I get up, and I felt kind of flat, delivered my remarks, and then, one after the other, the head of the medical association, the head of the hospital association, the head of the whatever it is, bang, 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 came up, banging, the administration, Joe Brennan is terrible, they should never have introduced this, you're terrible, you should have never introduced this, this is an example of overreach, you guys are going to harm people and everything else. And, the more they talked, the more I was feeling energized. And so I said, well, can I speak for a minute, after they were all done? And I remember saying, I said, this facility that you're in is a federally funded facility. How many of you get Medicare? Everybody raised hands. I said, guess where that comes from? And I said, guess who opposed it? The American Medical Association opposed it. How many of you are on Medicaid? They all raised their hands. Guess who opposed that? The American Medical Association. Who passed these things? George Mitchell, Ed Muskie, Joe Brennan. You think they're working against your best interests? And at that point, they all responded, and I could see the other guys just kind of ready to say, oh my goodness, what did we do this for? And you could just see how strongly people said, yes, this is what we need to do. If these are the guys that gave us Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security, we like them. And so that was, and Joe knew these things intuitively. I mean, he would talk to people. I mean, he was, terrific. He was always low key, but if you knew him well, he was very passionate. He just had it contained, and he channeled it in a very effective kind of way. I used to laugh. I mean, I'd hear people say, well, Brennan, we're not so sure he's that informed. He was very informed. I mean, he never missed a beat. He was very much on top of things, always asked good questions, and he handled politics. He let us handle the policy, and it's the politics that enable the policy. So I was very appreciative of his political skills.
During the administration, there was a real, what appeared to be a spike in the amount of child abuse that was going on. Maybe it was just more visible because there was a little bit more reporting on it or so. But talk a little bit about some of the efforts you undertook to, bring that more in the open and to begin addressing the issue.
Yeah, let me do a fast history on this one. From leaving office to the present, I was with the Child Welfare League of America for 12 years. We held in Portland, Maine, commissioners' roundtables. We'd have 45 states, 48 states, the secretary of the department and the child welfare director. They loved coming to Maine. They'd bring their spouses up. For the last 15 years, I've run a group called Every Child Matters, which a principal target has been child abuse in this country. I was recently appointed to a commission by President Obama. 6 people he appointed, 6 people in Congress, and I'm now sitting on a national commission to eliminate child abuse and neglect deaths. So I've had a lot of experience with this particular question. I was on the phone today with another reporter on this issue, and we were just, the basic numbers nationally, there's about 3 million reports of child abuse and neglect a year involving about 6 million children. There's over 100,000 confirmed sex abuse cases. There's almost 3,000 to 4,000 child abuse fatalities that occur in the country. 80% of the kids are 3 years old and younger. And if you look at the other rich Western democracies, it's nothing like it. It's nothing like what you see here. And so my first encounter with fatalities was the death of my sister at 11 years old from a brain tumor. And I thought, this is a very bad thing. I was much older than her. I was 25 or 26 years old. My mother never recovered from it. Nobody recovers from it. Nobody wants to see a child predecease them. And I remember going before the legislature shortly after her death, and Louis Gelbert was on one end of the table, and Ed Keller was on the other end of the table, and and the bookends, and it was a beautiful day in April, and the curtains were billowing, and they were reading newspapers and they were licking ice cream cones, but they weren't paying attention to who was standing at the podium. And in this particular case, it was now my turn to stand at the podium, and I wanted to talk about what was happening to children in the state. And nobody was paying attention, so I just didn't say anything, just stood there. And I waited and waited, and eventually they all understood that I was not going to testify, nor was I going to leave the podium until they heard what citizens wanted to convey to them. And that's when I brought up this topic. Then later on, I was in the regional office of DHS. I was just a citizen at that point working for United Way, and a friend of mine who ran that office was telling me that that morning he had separated 6 children from their mother at a court in which all 6 children are clinging to their mother's skirts and they don't want to go, and here's the state of Maine coming in and moving these kids out of there. And I thought, boy, this is a pretty serious thing. I didn't realize this sort of stuff happened very much. So we ended up, again, I mentioned to you when Joseph was the Attorney General, he looked at this Michael Fitzgerald case, and if you look at these cases, I mean, it's pretty grim. I mean, these kids are dying from, blunt force trauma. I mean, they get punched, kicked, thrown, etc. So under the aegis of United Way, this all comes back to the governor on this in a minute. Under the aegis of United Way, we created the first Child Abuse and Neglect Council in the state of Maine. And it was funded by Cumberland County. Now, Cumberland County is the richest Maine county overall, and we thought this would be a good idea to do this statewide. I became the commissioner, approached the governor, and said, what do you think about introducing a piece of legislation that creates a Child Abuse and Neglect Council in each of the 16 counties and funds them? And he said, that's a great idea, let's do that. And so, again, a bill was introduced. People like yourself were in the legislature. This is a good idea, let's do this thing. So we started with that, and what we basically said is, if you're lucky enough to choose the right parents, you don't need to worry about these things. But if you're unlucky enough to choose the right parents, then somebody needs to step forward on your behalf. And that's how Joe Brennan viewed it. And what we ended up doing was, I'll tell you, there was a case, everybody knows about the Angela Palmer case, the little girl that died in an oven in Lewiston back in 82 or 83. But a lot of people don't know about a case up in Washington County where a little girl died. And it was a very terrible, terrible situation. Everybody knew her presence. And of course, Washington County at that point didn't have its own daily newspaper. I think all it had was a Bangor Daily News. So this little girl could have died and gone under, and no one would have ever said anything. And I saw the case and saw where everybody failed in that case. Social workers, courts, district attorney, prosecutor, defense attorneys, hospital, doctors, etc. And I captured it and wrote it up and said to the governor, look at this. This is really bad. And he looked at it and he said, what do you want me to do? I said, well, first take a look at this judge. And without mentioning any names or anything, there was a judge who people were intimidated by, and they were afraid to appeal the decision. And he was a judge who was, he had strong views. He didn't get reappointed. And if you take a look at the history of judges not being reappointed, there aren't many of them. And I think it's a gutsy move to say, I'm not going to reappoint a judge. And it wasn't on just this case, it was some things that were related to it. But the point was, I wrote up something that wasn't flattering of anybody. It wasn't flattering of DHS, it wasn't flattering of the prosecutors, but this kid was known to everybody. She was 2.5 years old, and who was going to run interference for her? And so I wrote this report that the Associated Press picked up on, and knowing that the governor and I had talked at that point and said, what would you like me to do? And I said, why don't you appoint a blue ribbon panel, have them meet around a big table like this called your cabinet room. That will give it the gravitas and the importance that the issue deserves. Give them 8 months to report back. And at that point, what the governor did is he invited the head of the criminal courts, head of the civil courts, the district attorney, the attorney general, the staff from the Judiciary Committee, the Sheriff's Association. He invited them all in and said, you all have legal responsibility. Give me legal changes that you want in the law. Give me the administrative changes that you want, and tell me what it's going to cost. If I was ever caught up in a very, very controversial event, shootings in My Lai, in Vietnam, some big sex scandal someplace, some big embezzlement thing, whatever it was, no matter how controversial it was, I always had the feeling that if I ever want to be in front of a person who was going to judge something, it would be Joe Brennan. I mean, the guy had the absolute ability to reach over and understand what people believed in and their motives and everything else. I felt he was a very compassionate person, and he was not somebody who wanted to criminalize every aspect of human behavior and have everybody deputized to watch everybody else. I mean, he was very much hands off except when people need help, and I thought it was rather unusual. The other thing, by the way, is nationally, we had the Governor's Conference here in 1983, and here's an example. I was representing the governor at the staff level with all the other commissioners of Health and Human Services in the country. And I managed, working with them all, to get a 10-point plan to address the needs of the country's children and to propose things that would lift more children out of poverty. And we wrote a report called America's Children, Powerless in Need of Powerful Friends, which the governor did the letter and everything else. And what we agreed on, all the staff, is that we would put something in front of the governors when they met in Portland to adopt this 10-point plan to eliminate child poverty. And of course, the governor was hosting it, Governor Brennan was hosting it, and we weren't going to put anything forward without his saying, this is a good idea, yes, I'm going to do it. So he said, okay, he said, I'm going to put this 10-point plan in front of the other 49 governors in which we are going to commit ourselves as governors to tackle the problem of child poverty. And at the last minute, the chair of the Governors Association, which was the governor of Illinois, he saw the document, including the one that said basically raise minimum wage, increase the amount of money that gets transferred to people who are working full time. They're not able to earn an adequate living. He said, listen, he said, this has got to be dropped right now or I'm not going to support this thing. He said, forget it. This is not going to go anywhere. I'm not supporting this thing. So his chief of staff, his commissioner, comes to me and said, listen, he's the chair. He's not going to approve this. He's not going to approve this thing, and you're going to lose the whole thing. So you need to go to your governor right now and tell him what just happened, and he needs to say, oh, by the way, we were just kidding about this item. Let's drop this one. We'll just go the other 9. So I went back to the governor and said, Governor, here's what's going on. And he said, you know what? He said, there's 200 members of the national press here. If this guy wants to stand up and be the governor that says, I'm not in favor of reducing service of programs to children, I'm in favor of let him. We're going with this thing just as it is. And he forced the vote, and Thompson, the governor of Illinois, went along with it. He was pushed into doing something that he said he was not going to do. And that was very typical of, I think, of Governor Brennan's approach to this thing. He had a steely resolve on this thing. He wasn't going to let himself get pushed around. He knew it was the right thing to do. He was intimately familiar with what it all meant. And he just stood up to this guy and said, go ahead, if you want to vote against it, be my guest, but we're not. Got to pull it back. Pretty good, right?
Very good.
I mean, really, no, really. I mean, he was great. So I mean, I can do this stuff. I mean, there were other commissioners around the country that was like, Jesus, how do we get your guy out here? Let him run in Oregon, or let him run in Texas, or let him run in Arizona, God forbid. And, related to that, another kind of situation is, we used to have the old AFDC program, the Aid to Families with Dependent Children program. And it was very controversial, of course. And so-called reform took place 20 years ago under Bill Clinton, which in my opinion made child poverty worse in the country and hasn't improved things at all. But politically, the winds were beat up on poor people. And so I had to go forward representing the department, representing the governor, representing the people of the state of Maine, asking for funding of the AFDC program, the Aid to Families with Dependent Children program. So you're in the audience, you're waiting your turn to speak, and the legislature invites everybody else up to speak. And so the first people that came up, or the biggest group was the physicians. And the physicians said, we want a 4% increase in Medicaid payments or else. And that's what they said to the legislature. So it came to be my turn, and there were a lot of people there representing the docs. And they said, well, what about that? What about, why don't we just give these guys this money? You're proposing that they don't get anything. I mean, that they stay frozen where they are. I said, well, listen, I said, you got a choice. I said, you can transfer this much money to what is arguably the richest cohort of people in the state, or you can move the same amount of money to what is arguably the poorest cohort of people in the state of Maine, and that's children and mothers. And at that point, they said, you know what? That's a good idea. We don't want to put more money in the hands of the richest people. We want to put more money in the hands of the poorest people. So that's what they did. And for the next 8 years, there was no more talk about doing it because that was going to be the same argument we used. On the other hand, and this is where again, the governor comes into play in this thing because he wanted balance in these things. We said to these docs, listen, we will create a special office, a hotline, fully staffed with however many people it takes to handle all of your claims processing obstacles that you run into. And, you know, at one point when I had gone into office, Christ, the turnaround time was like 90 days. I mean, it was really, who could handle that? We made it like just slightly more than 2 weeks, 3 weeks. And so for the next 8 years, these guys could have their offices call. There were 4 or 5 or 6 people attending the phone all day, and all they did was process those claims, eliminate the obstacles, and make sure that these guys got paid. Because a lot of docs were more interested in being paid on time than they were interested in getting more money. And so, I mean, that's the kind of example that, you know, the governor didn't, you know, Michael, Jesus, now you got doctors mad at us. You know, now you got the insurance companies going. I mean, no, yes, we don't want to put more money in the hands of these guys. We want to put more money in the hands of these guys, right? So it was fun doing this stuff, really. I mean, really, because I knew that he basically agreed. I think sometimes he wishes, you know, we hadn't pressed the fast button, you know, forward as quickly as we had, but he took it. He took it well. His staff sometimes were a little nervous about it, but overall, we were all on the same team.
Given the variety of issues that you had to deal with and that you and the governor had particular interest in, what made you stay for a full 8 years working with him?
Well,
It
like
was
I
not
said,
as if you were going to get roses the next year or the year after. It was going to be a constant battle to try and get more resources in new places that people were going to fight you on.
well, you know, I mean, look, you know, what it comes down to is this Mother Teresa thing. You know, we are not called upon to be successful, just to try. And when you see people who are very vulnerable and cannot represent themselves, whether they are hydrocephalics at a pediatric nursing home in which a person cannot make any sounds and has absolutely no mobility, and you say, wait a minute, you know, who's going to run interference for this person or that abused child or that older person? You know, I remember, you know, a woman came into my office, and a guy had practically cut his leg off. He was a logger, and they had no insurance. They lived in a trailer, and I mean, they ran out of fuel, and they couldn't get any medical care. I mean, you can say, well, too bad. You made a series of choices in your life that got you here, and I'm here. No, I mean, working with Brennan and the basic philosophy that, you know, we embraced was, you're here to do something, you know, to try to help. So for me, the 8 years was easy because that position has statutes and regulations that cover this table and go to the ceiling, and they all end with the same last sentence: if approved or disapproved by the commissioner. The legal basis for all this ends with an individual. So when I first went up there, I would read the actual adoption documents. Well, a pile of adoption papers for one kid is a foot high. And, you know, it's a big thing. You're taking a child from a person. I mean, that's not a small thing. So becoming familiar with that and then realizing what a force for good government could be, why would I want to leave when we had a governor who said, hey, all we can do is fight. There's nothing wrong with fighting. Go out there and do it. That's the nature of the process. You know, prior to democracies, prior to governments, you get your way by hitting the other guy over the head with a club. Now you need votes in a legislature. You need to figure out how to work with the press. You need to work with advocacy groups. And it was a great experience for me that never could have happened had it not been for Brennan's own passion, compassion, smartness that said, go forth and multiply. And so we had people like Frank McGinney and numerous other people that were just top of the line people, which, by the way, I got to tell you, one of the biggest pleasant surprises for me was the competency of that state office building workforce. I could not believe just how overall dedicated, smart public servants they were up there. Whether it was water quality control, which we had the responsibility for, whether it was rabies, which we had the responsibility for. There's a whole series of people that are making sure that your restaurant is clean and you don't know that that's where your tax dollars are going. An example on that particular piece, some of you, we're not, this room's small enough, not some of you may all recover, though Sean probably wasn't born then, but I think Nancy might have been, and I think Dick was. We had a Thanksgiving crisis one time in which a well-known restaurateur, Johnny Martin, not the speaker, but the John Martin with the restaurants, and all of a sudden, 100 people got food poisoning, and one person died, and I think 20 people were hospitalized. And this guy owned 6 or 7 restaurants, and so this is posterity's sake. I'll be long dead by the time all this runs, and there won't be that many people to see it. But I'll just tell you, I got a call. So, of course, the Department of Human Services, who licenses these restaurants, is a division that has responsibility for this stuff. And there's a whole science behind it. I mean, it's not like makeup. It's like real stuff. If you don't do certain things, things happen. So we found out what the problem was, and it had to do with, these guys had cooked all these turkeys and giblets, and they had put them in those big 5-gallon white buckets, and then they moved them into a refrigerator, big walk-in refrigerator. Well, that's not the right sequence of events. You're supposed to let the stuff cool off first and then move it in, right? Instead, they moved it in, and the core of the stuff produced whatever it produces, bacteria, viruses, everything else. So I get a call from counsel to this restaurant chain telling me that we had to issue a report that didn't do damage to their client, because they had all these restaurants, they employed people, and oh, by the way, what good contributors we are to this thing. So I called his boss, the person who owned things. I said, listen, here's what you got to do. You got to make sure that I never get a call like that again, that anybody ever gets a call like that again, because we're going to work with you to make this happen. We realize what the potential consequences are, but you guys have to own 100% of the responsibility for this thing, and we're not going to do it quietly. We're going to say, this is what it is, and now you're certified, clean, everybody should go back doing what they were, it's no problem. I said, but if we get another call like this, it's going to the Attorney General. That's where this next call is going to go. And so, again, I didn't think twice that, oh my God, the governor will be so upset because we treated one of his donors the way we did. Never had to worry about it. It was just like, he would have not spent 2 seconds on that, saying just whatever you have to do, right? So asking why I could do 8 years, I mean, I enjoyed it. I mean, it was great working with him, working with the other commissioners, working with people in the state of Maine. It was the best job I ever had.
Given all of the experiences you've had since you left the position of commissioner and all the things that were of importance to you, do you see areas where things you did then have continued on to the present, doing good things, or have we seen a relapse, sliding back in some important areas that we wish we didn't?
Yeah, I think that the long human history is, like I said, is what they call disjointed incrementalism, right? 2 steps forward, 1 step back. I think that in my lifetime, the politician who I most strongly disagreed with was Ronald Reagan. And I disagreed with him because of his hostility and his trashing of our national government. A national government that improved the lives of tens of millions of people over a long period of time, and a national government that is us. So I make it's never confusing to me. The government is us at some point, whatever it is that we want out of it. So I think that this very anti-government hostility that Reagan sowed in California, that won him the California stuff and then won him the presidency nationally, what I remember in that case of Reagan holding office is, and we're going to cut maternal child health services, and we're going to cut nutrition programs, we're going to cut child abuse and neglect services, we're going to cut. In favor of what? In favor of enhancing the wealth of others and so forth and so on. So I have seen, yes, over the last 30, 40 years, I think that Maine children may not be as in good health as they were previously. The abuse issue has certainly not gone away. We haven't made a dent in poverty. It's as bad or worse now than it has been in 30, 40 years. I think this income inequality thing is a huge thing. And for me, one of the disappointments that I've had over the last 30 or 40 years is that Joe Brennan was not in the United States Senate. I think he would have been a great senator, and he would have brought forward a belief system that says government is the last best hope for a lot of people, and we can do good things and big things with it. So for me, I'm getting ready to wind down a career. Some things have been better, some things are worse, but it's an eternal vigil. Not just democracy, but healthy human growth and development. I mean, it just doesn't happen. It happens because we make commitments to help each other, to create laws, to do whatever, create institutions, and so it disturbs me to see privatizing this, privatizing that, lack of public accountability. It's disturbing. I think that the next 2 years are going to be very conflictual in Washington, and there are no elections that ever resolve anything. I mean, it's just endless struggle, and there are a group of people, particularly, that will never be able to adequately represent themselves, and I think that that's as important a mission and responsibility today as it ever has been.
Looking back on the time that you spent working in the administration, what lessons that you took from that have served you well in your activities after you left state government?
Well, if you look at Maine then versus, and it's hard for me to say today because I've been, kind of remote. I come back to Maine a lot because of my grandkids and so forth, but I'm not daily intimately familiar as I was previously. I think the big thing that I saw was that in Maine, over a long period of time, public health, welfare, education grew in a positive way for decades. And when you looked at where Maine kids stood nationally in education, in child abuse, in health care, in infant mortality rates, for many years, Maine ranked first, second, third, fourth, fifth, constantly in the top 10. Today, that's not where Maine is. We rank lower than that, and I think we have failed to sustain the investments and the promises that early legislators, early Congresses made. So being in Maine during that time, seeing what was there, when I went to other states, I could not believe how much more severe the problems were than they were in Maine. So I thought we had a lot of serious issues in Maine, and we did, and we do. But they are not at the level of intensity in terms of the numbers and scope and frequency as you get in many other parts of the country, whether it's the southern states or whether it's our big urban areas. We have shootings, they have 10 times more shootings. We have domestic violence, they have double the domestic violence. We have high school dropouts, they have triple the dropouts. We have this many kids killed, they have many more kids killed. They simply, so I left Maine thinking, even though we're a small state with a modest income, if you do things in a way with the legislature and the people, you can make things forward. One of the things that I got in Maine was I had been a lobbyist for a long time, and of course I worked with the department. But the Republicans that we dealt with were people like Joe Sewell, Bill Garso, Dick Morton from Farmington. Bill Garso was from Cumberland, of course, Joe Sewell from Old Town. I mean, these were people that you could have conversations with and go back and forth and say, well, what if we did this? Or how about if we do that? Or how about if we do that? As opposed to scorched earth theory, my way or the highway, and that's it. I mean, that was a very big change for me, which I actually picked up as soon as I went to other states. There was a level of, there was a lack of friendliness, really, among, there was just much sharper ideological divisions. And I think part of that in Maine is there's a make-do, pragmatic side to the state that is associated with being at the end of the line. It's associated with the cold temperatures. It's associated with modest incomes in which people kind of rely on each other to a large degree. That may be less true today than earlier, but certainly in my growing up, that's what's going on. And I didn't see as much of it in other states.
And there's not much of a barrier between the decision makers and the problems, whereas in some other states you have staff of staff of staff
Yeah.
that separates people from reality.
That's very true, and having seen the other states, I would never shrink the Maine legislature. I think it's just fine as it is. If you added more people, it would be okay. I think the fact that you're responsible to 8 or 9 or 10,000 people is a good thing. If you're in California, you're responsible to 1 million. I mean, how do you work that? You work that through television slogans. It costs millions of dollars to deliver a very partial kind of a message. The other thing that I would just note that's really different if Maine and elsewhere. Maine is the whitest state. It's the oldest state in terms of citizenry. We do not begin to have the level of depravity that you see with states that have large, poor minority populations. There are still huge racial divides that whatever it looks like in Maine is nothing compared to the South and to many of our big urban areas. It's at a whole other level. Politically, economically, it's more challenging.
For a final wrap-up question, so what was the story about poker games at the Blaine House?
Oh my goodness. One of the great pleasures of being commissioner was being invited over to the state, to the governor's mansion on a regular basis, or intermittent, not regular, but quite often. And the governor is very competitive, and he loves playing poker. And he would try and get me to engage with him in pool games because he was a very good pool player.
Yes, he is.
And I cost me quite a bit of money to learn that. And then he'd invite me over, like, say, to shoot basketball. And I didn't realize that he was as good as he was, but he didn't realize that I was better. And one thing, I was the captain of my high school basketball team, so I said, this is where I lured him into the trap. But where we were both more on equal footing was playing poker. And he would have various cabinet members over, Supreme Court members over. There's no real money to change hands. I don't know what Maine law is about this thing, but it was just for fun. And we had, all these different individuals come in. And the deal was, the game didn't end till the governor was ahead. And so I said, Joe, I'm really tired. I said, I've got to give a speech tomorrow morning to the Chamber of Commerce in Lewiston. Michael, just another round.
round.
Just stay for just a couple of more rounds. And around the table was like, all right, let's all. No, I don't have anything. I'm folding. Okay, sure, you win the pot, Governor. And I think he must have read the accounts of Harry Truman, who used to do the same thing. Harry Truman, you could leave. William O. Douglas wrote, the Supreme Court justice wrote that you could leave the table after the president had won his money back. Until that happened, we're all going to stay here until we get to the bottom of this. And Governor Brennan could be like that. Why are you leaving so early? What's the rush? It's only 2 o'clock. 2 o'clock? I got to be someplace at 7 tomorrow morning. So that was just a lot of fun. It was a side benefit, and he was a very, very spirited competitor, although he'd say it quietly, but you knew he was serious.
I can confirm that, having sent him on a couple of occasions, had dinner with he and Charlie Prey and Paul Violet.
Oh, yeah.
And the governor was a master at losing the first game of pool when there was money on the table.
That's right.
And then run the table for like
Oh,
8 times in a row until there was nothing left in anybody's pockets but his.
No, that is absolutely correct. And you had to, you'd sometimes be there with a guy like you would come over and you think, geez, I need to tell him about this. And it was too late. The governor pulled you in and that was it. And you weren't going to leave the table until you coughed up your money. So he was very fun that way. He was very, and I like to think that poker is a somewhat cerebral game. And he really knew the game. He could calculate the odds, and he knew his percentages and ratios and all of that stuff very well. He was a great bluffer. That was, of course, because how can you read a guy? Is he happy? Is he sad? I don't know. I mean, in the best of times, I can't tell where he is on this thing. But just to show you what a skilled politician he was. First of all, if you were on a table, he would go to every person at the table. But I remember one time he opened up the Blaine House to some foster parents coming in, and they met in his office. And on the way in, Governor, this is Brenda Jones. Governor, this is Nancy. Governor, this is Sean. Governor, this is so-and-so. hello, hello, hello. The meeting would end. He'd be at the door. I'd be standing back. Goodbye, Nancy. Nice to have met you. Nice to have met you, Sean. I don't know how the hell he did it. But he would memorize the names of everybody who came in, and on their way out, he'd give them a pat on the back, and, there they go.
Yeah.
So people were very loyal to him, and I got to say, at the end of 8 years, people were willing to knock down doors for him. And he had some bright lights there in his group that could have gone on to other places, and they didn't because he made governing interesting and serious and fun. He wasn't occupying space. He wanted something to happen.
Yeah. I can tell you that Nancy and I, the time we were there, we were so focused on the immediate issue, we weren't looking at the bigger picture. But looking back on it 30 years after, it's a remarkable 8-year period of time that
It is.
not compared by any
No.
governor since, and probably before.
Yeah, no, I think he was a very serious player, and there were almost no issues that he shied away from. I mean, he took that position against sending National Guard to Nicaragua. He was the first governor, one of the first governors to propose shutting down an atomic power plant, if I recall correctly. He did
That's
propose that. I mean, these weren't light decisions, and he just did what, in the end, was, does this leave us better off or not? So his public spiritedness was unchallenged. I mean, that he wanted the right thing to be done, and no one would have ever approached him on anything other than straight, clean kind of thing. I mean, he just wasn't like that.
The unfortunate thing was because he didn't toot his own horn, that it will take a while for people to fully appreciate where he stands in the world of governance in the state of Maine, perhaps till after he's gone.
Well, I tell you, I think that's the truth. I mean, it's he really was not somebody that spent a lot of time complimenting himself, and in part that reflects a strong ego with a lot of certainty that he was doing the right thing. But in some instances, and when you talk nationally, it's a much bigger stage. But some people feel, and I'm one of them, that President Obama has not talked enough about some of the things that he's achieved. And Joe Brennan did not. He was modest about it, and he kind of let it speak for itself. But in politics, it doesn't always speak for itself. You need to kind of speak to it yourself. But he did a lot, we haven't seen his kind much.
That's right. Michael, thank you very much for your time. We appreciate this. And it's possible as we go along, we may come back and revisit you for another go-round on some other things.
Well, if anyone wants to come back because they have contradictory evidence, tell them I'm not listening.
Oh, no, just to expand on or get into new issues that we didn't get into today.
No, I know. No, you know the thing that I'm trying to think of the little girl's name up in Washington County. Here's something the governor did. Let's think of what her name was for a minute. Angela Palmer was the little girl that was killed in Lewiston, but this other one was the one that really moved the system. And what Joe ended up doing is her father was tried and convicted. I mean, just as citizens, you'll be interested in this. The DA we're not on, or are we? Still on? Yeah. No, it's I don't care. It's fine. The DA in Washington County was a part-time DA. So he was a part-time DA, which meant that he was a part-time practicing attorney. He had to come before the same judge as a DA and as a private attorney, which is, challenging. So you had this guy, the father, who had been arrested and charged with committing crimes because of broken bones that he had left in previous marriages with previous kids. So when you look at how you protect children, you either remove the child from the perpetrator, which is what CPS can do. They can remove a child from the perpetrator. Or you remove a perpetrator from the child, which is what the criminal justice system does, right? That's DAs, that's criminal courts, that's cops. And if you don't have them, CPS just watches it go by. So in the case of this father, the defense attorney, his attorney, I think it was 7 times asked for a stay, asked to postpone the trial. 7 times the DA said, okay, and 7 times the judge said, well, if you guys agree, fine. What that meant is that this guy was still out there, and even though he's told, don't go near the house. Piece of paper. I mean, you can do what you want. And the guy came back, killed the kid, and of course, his attorney, at the time he was getting these 7 stays, thought he was pretty smart, protecting his client, keeping him out of the criminal justice system. But in the end, the guy is in Maine State Prison today, and he would have been better off had he been tried and sentenced to 10 years when he hadn't killed somebody.
Yeah.
Well, you may not remember this, but the governor that year built all of this into his State of the State address. And I have given this speech around the country, all over the place. One of the jurors sent the governor the check back that he received from the Maine courts for serving on the jury. And he writes on it, he says, "Dear Governor Brennan," he said, "I was a juror in this case. It was the worst thing that I've ever experienced. I am a Vietnam veteran. I was over there to protect people like this child, and I am so sorry that we didn't. Here's my check for $157.22. Please spend it someplace that will protect a child." Sign, boom. I mean, the whole place was just, muffled, and here's the governor reading this thing. And I'm the guy that's lucky enough to have a governor that actually does these things, says these things, believes these things, and all across the country, even to this day, what you get in a lot of places is don't ask, don't tell. I don't want to know the scope of this problem because you're going to expect me to do something about it for a bunch of poor people, and I'm not going to get any rewards for it politically. I mean, that was the experience over 8 years. So he was great to work with.